Rob Green, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
Rob, as a teacher, what kind of things do you teach about in history prior to this current situation? What was the course like in Quebec?
Well, I will say that there was many of the problems that we've been voicing our concerns about with the new curriculum. Many of those same problems existed in the old curriculum. So the last curriculum was very much focused on the story of the Quebec nation as opposed to the story of Quebec society. However, I will say, particularly with the depictions of immigrant communities to Quebec, we saw a lot more in the old curriculum than we're seeing in the new curriculum.
Now, this curriculum was developed by the Parti Québécois when they were in power briefly, and we know that the Parti Québécois is a separatist, independentist. They want Quebec to separate from Canada.
Yeah.
Who prepared this course?
Well, the PQ launched this curriculum reform in the normal way that curriculum reform is done in Quebec, and that began with a committee of experts that had very diverse representation. However, soon after the first couple meetings of that more diverse committee happened, they essentially turned the curriculum reform process over to a conservative sovereigntist lobby group called La Coalition pour l'Histoire, a group that for the last 20 years has been sort of banging the drums in the media about the denationalization of Quebec history, and which is absurd because I just told you that, like, the old history curriculum probably didn't have, there hasn't been a history curriculum in Quebec that's had more references to the Quebec nation. So it is sort of an absurd charge that they've been making, and literally the curriculum reform process was basically handed to them.
These are very nationalist historians who wrote this.
Exactly, and they're a group that's funded by basically the most conservative elements in the nationalist movement.
Now, what are your concerns? Now, as I understand it, when this was introduced, English teachers in Montreal and Quebec were saying, "Whoa, this is beyond the pale. There are many problems with this history. It is very nationalist. It leaves out a lot of actual history to promote a separatist agenda."
Yeah.
And there was complaints about that. What happened?
Well, I should actually say that initially teachers were very supportive of this reform because ostensibly it was being done for reasons that had to do with the structure of the program. So it used to be that year one of the program, you'd have the whole history of Quebec and Canada, and then year two, you'd speed through that whole history 4 times focused on different themes. And this was very cumbersome for students. So the ostensible reason for this reform was to change the structure to make it more like other history programs, half the history in year one and the other half in year two. However, along the way, it really became about content as well. And that's where both teachers in the Anglophone sector, but also First Nations groups and Inuit groups began to speak up about what they were seeing in that content. And that was basically, the elimination of Quebec's ethnic diversity. We see no reference to immigrant communities. We see the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had been sort of ignored. And Anglophones were sort of presented as in the historical narrative in the role of comic book villains. We're sort of presented as a monolithic group of elites that are there to sort of impede the progress of Quebec at every turn. And so it was all of those issues that I think, a variety of different people started to raise awareness about.
Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that the separatist government introduced this, and there were complaints about it. And now we have, since then, a new government, supposedly a federalist-leaning government, who heard these complaints and said, we will correct them. And what happened there?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. This has been what has been so baffling about this. And theories range from just straight up government incompetence, that they didn't realize this reform process that they inherited was underway and just kind of let it continue until it was sort of too late. People are also thinking maybe it's because they had sent the textbooks to print before that first wave of criticism last year.
And so this is a money question.
Yeah, it could be a money question. But there's also the issue of how sincere they were about making changes. So last week, a press release was put out by the Quebec School Board, basically saying that the most recent round of consultation of Indigenous communities that happened was a farce. And even worse than that, it was repeating colonial patterns of the government dealing with Indigenous people that really, really need to finally come to an end.
So the history that you are obliged to teach your students, if I'm understanding this correctly, leaves out almost entirely the Indigenous aspect of Quebec and Canada. And the Anglophone community are treated sort of as, you say, villains or disdainfully and impeding the progress of...
Yeah, and in the first draft of the curriculum, there was not a single reference to a positive contribution to Quebec society by an Anglophone actor or person. In the revised draft, there is a single reference to a positive contribution. It does acknowledge that Anglophones were active in the early days of Quebec's feminist movement. But, to me, the really big omission here is the Irish, because the Irish were Montreal's original working class. They were involved in some of the early labor struggles. They were a part of even, that working class history is even part of the early history of the Montreal Canadians that is very important in this city and in this province. So to leave the Irish out of the picture is really problematic in my view.
Well, I mean, as a history teacher, when you talk about Montreal, which was at one time the single most important city in Canada up until, say, the 1960s, we had a city. Who built the city in that sense as a modern city? Was it not the Scottish and we have McGill University and all the hospitals, and these are donated and so on and so forth. I mean, as an Anglophone and a historian, how do you feel about this? I mean,
well, I feel that that history is being hijacked by a political agenda, and I want to be clear that when I've been criticizing the curriculum, I'm not saying that I want to replace one ideologically driven narrative with another. I'm not looking to replace a sovereignist narrative with a federalist narrative. I'm looking for students to be exposed to the range of different perspectives that have existed in Quebec society over the years, because it's only by exposing them to a range of perspectives that they can develop critical thinking skills. And that's what a history course is supposed to be about. So, even though, I am an Anglophone teaching in an English school board, I see one of my biggest roles as an Anglophone teacher is to help my Anglophone students understand the perspectives of the Francophone majority. And that's how we can start to build social cohesion and sort of break down the notion of the two solitudes.
But again, if you're teaching Anglophones and want to teach them an expanded and I don't know if I should use the word more truthful history, what's happening with the Francophones, who are the majority? Are they being, shall I use the word propagandized?
That is the worry, right? Like, I'm actually not so concerned about the history teachers that I know in the English Montreal School Board, for example. They're excellent teachers, and they are going to be supplementing the curriculum in a way that does justice for their students. But as you point out, the problem is, what about students up in Lac-Saint-Jean? Or what about even students in the English system whose teacher found out they were teaching the program 5 days before they started, who doesn't have the time to be preparing the supplemental materials?
Well, a colleague of mine had a child in school, and that person said when the child went to the history class, the teacher said, here's the official thing, the history that you need for the test. Exactly. So learn that. Yeah. But here's the history that I'm going to teach you, which is varied. Yeah. I mean, wow.
What message is that sending? This is really part of the problem for me as a teacher, is that there's all sorts of research out there about how effective pedagogy involves creating materials in which students can see themselves reflected in one way or another. And when students don't see, and so when I think just my school, Westmount High, it's a multicultural school in downtown Montreal, this new curriculum is rendering many of my students invisible and sort of demonizing another group of them. So where do they see themselves reflected? They don't. And what that does is that makes my job as a teacher trying to get them to pass a standardized test that much harder, let alone trying to get them to develop a love of history, which ultimately should be my most important priority. But because of these ministry exams, I sometimes have to focus on getting them through that.
Is there a problem in Canada in the fact that we don't have a countrywide history agenda, but it's controlled by the provinces?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of justification to that. Just for example, I think, Canada's history is vast, and I think it does make sense, for example, that British Columbia's history curriculum would be focused on some different things. But I see it maybe in another way, that I think it's problematic in any public education system in a democratic society, that people that are part of that society are being eliminated from the historical narrative. I just think the role of public education should be about helping us understand each other, building social cohesion, helping students better understand and think critically about the society in which they live.
What's the solution, Rob Green? I mean, your group is asking for changes.
Yeah.
What's going to happen? What do you think is going to happen?
We've launched an online petition, and we've gotten a lot of signatures already. We thus far the efforts that we've made in speaking out, I think they have had an impact. Like, there have been some changes that have been made, but I think it's going to take more. So, basically what we've demanded of government in our petition is sort of two things. In the short term, to immediately work with school boards and other stakeholders to develop supplemental materials to immediately supplement what's there, because we realize the government isn't going to overnight produce new textbooks and have a whole new program. So we've got a short-term goal that's sort of about a Band-Aid solution. But then the long-term solution is extensive public consultations of all the various communities to make sure that this is being done right. Because again, when reading about the consultations that weren't consultations of Indigenous communities, this is awful. This is the opposite direction that we should be going, and particularly in light of the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I mean, one of those recommendations is that every provincial Minister of Education should have an expert in Indigenous history as sort of an assistant to them. And that, to my knowledge, that has not happened in Quebec, and it needs to happen. And had it happened, we would not be seeing some of the problems in the curriculum that we see now.
Rob Green, thank you very much for coming in today.
Great pleasure.